So can the Reagan Revolution be stopped? Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. The Reagan Revolution rolls along. I mean, this is absolutely astonishing what's going on with Donald Trump's new budget. New Hampshire is voting. We'll be, taking your calls on any of these things. And in our second hour, Grover Norquist is going to drop by and explain to us why the Trump budget is such a marvelous thing. I said the Reagan Revolution continues. It never really stopped, right? I mean, from 1933 until 1981, we were operating under Keynesian economics, under an economic system that promotes and builds the interests of the middle class and working class people. This is what both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are calling for our country to return to. And then in 1981, Reagan said, no, we're going to discard that. We're going to go back to Warren Harding economics from 1920 that brought us the roaring 20s and the great crash of 1929. We're going to go back to that. And here we are. The social contract, Trump's $4.8 trillion budget, cuts Medicare by $850 billion, cuts Medicaid by $920 billion, cuts Social Security by $30 billion, cuts food stamps by $181 billion, cuts education, support to education by 8%. You think student debt is bad now? You think our schools are falling apart now? Cuts health and human services by 9%, just as, the world is facing an epidemic. Really? It cuts the Environmental Protection Agency by 26%. That nasty agency that, the Kochs and all the oil barons hate. Cuts our national parks, the Interior Department, by 13%. Cuts housing in the United States by 15%. And this is when the economy is on a roll. I mean, this is over $1 trillion in cuts for health care. And all these other massive cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, cuts for funding for the Centers for Disease Control and research into diseases like the coronavirus. It kneecaps the Environmental Protection Agency. Paul Ryan may no longer be in politics, and Ronald Reagan may be dead, but the politics of greed and the top 1% continue to totally rule the Republican Party and have, frankly, an outsized influence in the Democratic Party. Until, in my humble opinion, the Democratic Party returns to the New Deal and Great Society, to its own roots in the New Deal and the Great Society, in Keynesian economics. Until the Democratic Party, as at least a solid majority of the Democratic Party, repudiates Reaganomics and says, this experiment we've been doing since 1981, it ain't working out. Until the majority of the Democratic Party does that, it's going to continue like this. The Financial Times just reported that new research from Goldman Sachs shows that, quote, the richest 1% of Americans now account for more than half the value of all stocks owned by U.S. households. The bottom 90% of America holds 12% of stocks. People go, oh, the economy's going great. Have you looked at the Dow? Who's in the Dow? Oh, the top 1%. Yeah, that's right. They own over half of it. Top 10% own, over 90% of it. And we think the economy is doing well? I mean, this is Reaganism continued. The Financial Times adds, the widening wealth disparity has been driven by stagnant wages for many Americans. I would add, by the way, since 1981, which held them back from partaking in the stock market's gains in the past decade. Despite the dot-com collapse and the global financial crisis, the broad U.S. stock market has climbed more than tenfold since 1990. In other words, if you put $1,000 into the stock market in 1990, you'd have $10,000 right now doing nothing. And that $9,000 increase in value, or if you'd put $100,000 into the stock market in 1990, you'd have $1 million right now. And that $900,000 in profit that you show, you'd pay a maximum 15% tax on it because it's a capital gain. People like Paris Hilton, who make their living sitting on their butt around the pool waiting for the dividend checks to arrive, pay a lower tax rate than you do and do nothing. Back to the Financial Times. Despite the dot-com collapse and the global financial crisis, the broad U.S. stock market has climbed more than tenfold since 1990, gains that have mostly accrued to the richest part of the population. And people say, well, you know, you're talking about economic warfare here. You're talking about politics of envy. You're talking about, you know, criticize the rich. Yeah. As a matter of fact, Warren Buffett laid it out 10, 15 years ago. You know, he said, yes, there is an economic war going on in this country, and a class war was the word he used, and my class is winning, he said. Pointing out that he pays a lower tax rate as a billionaire, as one of the 10 richest men in America. He pays a lower income tax rate as a billionaire than his secretary does. Meanwhile, the scam, I mean, you know, there's so many dimensions to the Reaganomics scam, to the neoliberal economic scam. There's the so-called we need free trade scam part of it. I think, you know, most of us are familiar with that, particularly if you're old enough to remember Ross Perot in '92. He was right. And now we're seeing, you know, some of the problems. I mean, you're going to start seeing, as China shuts down, and they're having a real hard time. You know, they just ended the lunar holiday, the New Year, the Chinese New Year, and said to everybody, get back to work. And at Foxconn plans, according to the Financial Times this morning, you got 10% of workers showing up. People are scared. Now, what does that mean? It means that Hyundai, the South Korean car manufacturer that buys their parts from China, has had to stop production of cars. It means that Apple iPhones aren't being made. Now, what happens when that stock shock starts hitting the United States? General Motors makes engine blocks in China. A lot of the electronics in our cars are made in China. This was the point that many of us who are opposed to so-called free trade were making for a long, long time. Got it. Okay. And it's, you know, this is something that we all saw coming. 50,000 factories were lost in the first, you know, decade and a half after, here in the United States, after NAFTA was signed. And then we got the Korean free trade deal and the Panama free trade deal and the, you know, the most favored nation status and permanent normal trade relations with China and all this other stuff. So you've got that offshoring scam, the manufacturing scam. And manufacturing, by the way, Trump says, oh, manufacturing is wonderful. Manufacturing is actually in a recession here in the United States. And then you got the big pharma scam, right? The big pharmaceutical companies ripping us off. This from Utah, the state of Utah, a Republican-controlled state. A Republican state representative by the name of Norm Thurston authored a piece of legislation in Utah called the Right to Shop Bill, which essentially says that the state and the state's going to ignore the federal government's efforts to prevent people from shopping outside the state of Utah for medication. The result of this is that the state itself is now paying their employees up to $500 for a round-trip airplane ride to Mexico to buy a year's worth of their prescription medications. Honest to God. This is, you know, one participant, this is from The Guardian, a piece by Edward Helmore. The headline, Utah cuts healthcare costs by flying employees to Mexico for their prescriptions. This is the state. One participant, 62-year-old teacher Ann Lovell, said she saved as much as $2,400 by traveling from Salt Lake City to San Diego and then crossing the border in order to refill a prescription for her arthritis medication. Utah estimates that it is saving $225,000 a year, and so far they've only signed up 400 of the state's 160,000 public employees. When they expand this to all 160,000 public employees, the state of Utah is going to save millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. because the scam continues. What's it going to take to blow up this scam? I've my personal opinion, I've said this many times in this program, I wrote a book about it, The Crash of 2016, is that it's going to take an economic disaster. I hope I'm wrong. I hope just a simple election can do it, and that election happens this year. I suppose you could say that the disaster was Donald Trump, and maybe that was enough of a disaster to cause people to go, what the hell is going on here? And start reconsidering how they're voting.